Welcome to today's webinar, Reducing Food Waste and Methane Emissions, Insights from the U.S. EPA's latest reports. I'm so excited to have you joining us today. We've said before that anytime the EPA comes out with information on food waste is a big deal. And just last month, they came out with not one, but two reports about the topic. The first is called From Field to Bin, the Environmental Impacts of U.S. Food Waste Management Pathways. And it synthesizes the latest science on the environmental impacts of how food waste is commonly managed in the U.S. It's the companion report to EPA's 2021 From Farm to Kitchen, which analyzed the environmental footprint of food waste in the farm to consumer supply chain. And the big news from this report is that EPA's food waste hierarchy has been updated with a new wasted food scale. So we'll be talking more about that specifically in just a moment. The other report is called Quantifying Methane Emissions from Landfilled Food Waste, and it's the first time EPA has published modeled estimates of annual methane emissions released into the atmosphere from landfilled food waste. More food reaches municipal solid waste landfills than any other material, but its contribution to landfill methane emissions has not previously been quantified. So this is an incredibly important contribution to the body of knowledge about food waste impacts on the environment. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dana Gunders, and I'm the executive director here at REFED. And if you're not familiar with REFED, we are a national nonprofit working to end food loss and waste across the U.S. food system by advancing data-driven solutions. Now, before I introduce our friends from the EPA, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that next week is Thanksgiving. And I think it's safe to say that probably the largest meal any of us will have all year is going to take place next week. Unfortunately, every year at Thanksgiving, a lot of food goes to waste, and REFED estimates the amount that we expect to go to waste during that meal. So how much do you think that will be this year? Well, we estimate that nearly 312 million pounds of food will be wasted across the country this year. That includes turkey, stuffing, green beans, potatoes, pie, everything. 312 million pounds of food with a total cost of more than $600 million. What will happen to that food? Well, we've got some great minds here to talk about that today, although I think most of us know pretty much where it's going to go. All right, so to get into it, first I'd like to introduce Claudia Fabiano. She joined the EPA in 2002 and has been working on sustainable management of food team in EPA's Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery since 2016. In addition to her role at EPA to reduce wasted food in the U.S., she is on the board of Washington, D.C.'s Food Recovery group. And when she's not chasing after her two daughters, she's coming up with creative solutions for how to cook what's left in her fridge and get her kids to eat it. Welcome, Claudia. And we also have with us Shannon Kenny. Shannon is the Senior Advisor for Food Waste in the U.S. EPA's Office of Research and Development. Shannon coordinates wide-ranging research on food waste from prevention to waste management. She has more than 20 years of experience at EPA, primarily focusing on climate change. She also served as climate change staff for the House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee and Select Committee on Global Warming and Energy Independence. Welcome, Shannon. With that, I will turn it over to Shannon for a few minutes just to share some introductory slides for the reports that just came back, and then we'll be back for the discussion.
Thank you all for joining us today. As Dana mentioned, these are two reports that we just released in the last few weeks. They're both available on our website, both on the Sustainable Management of Food website, as well as the Food Waste Research website at EPA. And we'll make sure that the direct links to the reports get put up in the chat. Next slide. So we just wanted to open with a few remarks about sort of what we found, what we learned, before opening it up for conversation. So first, looking at the landfill methane study that we did, you all know that when organic waste goes into a landfill, it's anaerobic there, there's no oxygen, so methane is generated. And some of that methane then escapes out to the atmosphere and becomes greenhouse gas emissions. Methane traps 28 times more heat than carbon dioxide over a 100-year time frame, and even more importantly, about 80 times more over a 20-year time frame. So reducing methane emissions is a big deal in the fight to tackle climate change. We undertook this study because we knew that MSW landfills, municipal solid waste landfills, this is where the things that sort of household, restaurant, retail waste, where it goes, what we commonly think of as trash, we know they're the third largest source of methane emissions from human-related activities in the US. And we know that food waste, like Dana said, is the number one thing going into landfills. About 20 to 25% of what goes into the landfill is wasted food. But we didn't know how that 20 to 25% of the waste, how much of the methane emissions it was responsible for. Most of the time when folks do landfill methane analysis, they look at municipal solid waste as sort of a mixed bag and take an average when they figure out the methane emissions. But we know now that different types of waste behave differently in landfills. And so if we want to choose successful strategies to reduce these methane emissions, we probably need to know where it's coming from. And so that was the purpose of this work. So to model the emissions from food waste specifically, we used a lot of existing widely used EPA data and models. Some of you may be familiar with both the LandGEM model and the WARM model. And then we took data from our greenhouse gas inventory. We took data from our greenhouse gas reporting program and other places. And then we looked at what's the current mix of open landfills in the United States? What kind of technologies do they have in place? What sort of schedules do they operate and maintain them on? And then figured out that 58% of the methane emissions coming from municipal solid waste landfills in the United States is coming from food. So food has an outsized impact. It makes up 20 to 25% of what goes in, but it makes up 58% of the methane emissions coming out of the landfill. And if you flip to the next slide. Equally important, I think, as a finding from this report was looking at over time. The statistics I just gave you were for 2020, but when you look over time, the figure here is showing total methane emissions from landfills from 1990 to 2020, with the portion in red highlighted is the portion from food. So you'll see that total emissions from landfills are going down, and that's largely because we've put on landfill gas capture systems. We've put more of them on and we've put more effective ones on. But the fraction representing food is actually getting bigger, not smaller. And that's because food waste decays really quickly. So because it decays quickly, it often releases methane and a substantial amount of its methane before those systems are in place. If you think about a landfill, you pile up all the food and other waste in one place, and then you cap it and you install a system, and then you move on to the next section. But what happens is the food waste has already given off a lot of its methane before that happens. So in 2020, we think that's the last bar here. You'll see that we think about 61% of the methane that was generated by food waste actually became fugitive emissions. It wasn't captured by the landfill gas collection systems. So, and then another sort of accelerating factor is that while we are doing a better job as a country of not putting paper in the landfill, not putting cardboard in the landfill, we're actually putting more food waste in the landfill each year. So when you look at how quickly it decays, plus the fact that we're putting more of it, food waste emissions are increasing on an absolute basis and on a share basis of total methane emissions. Claudia?
Yeah, and what these findings really highlight is the need to do everything we can to divert food from landfills. Something we knew, but I think having these pretty compelling stats out there really drives that point home. And obviously this can be accomplished in many ways, and we'll talk about a lot of those different approaches in this hour. Of course, preventing food waste from being generated in the first place has the most environmental benefits due to all the resources it takes to produce the food. But there's of course need for a variety of other options too, including recycling options like composting and anaerobic digestion. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we embarked on this project in the first place. We began research on the environmental impacts of wasted food from farm to consumer in a report that came out in 2021. And then we continued that analysis by doing sort of the second piece of that, which is evaluating 11 common wasted food management pathways from field to bin. And the intention here was really to update or to confirm what our food recovery hierarchy that we've had since the 1990s was saying. So we hadn't updated that hierarchy since it was released in the 90s, and the environmental impacts have really been studied much more since then, especially the contributions of wasted food to GHG emissions and climate change. We've also seen that technologies and operational practices have changed in some cases, and wasted food is being managed in ways that were just not included in the previous hierarchy. Things like upcycling, land application, and sending food down the drain and leaving it unharvested were not included in that hierarchy. So, in terms of our we've had more of a shift recently in our sustainable materials management work to focusing on building a circular economy. And a circular economy, I'll just pause here and talk about that for a second, reduces material use and redesigns materials to be less resource intensive and recaptures waste as a resource to manufacture new materials and products. And the goal really of a circular economy is to decouple economic growth from resource extraction by capturing greater value from existing products and materials. And this contrasts with the traditional linear take, make, use, dispose economy where waste is seen as something to sort of send away and get rid of. So in light of changes to materials management priorities and advances in technologies, and of course the urgency of addressing climate change, and in response to calls for a new hierarchy from partners from across the huge food supply chain, EPA undertook an analysis of the environmental impacts of wasted food and management pathways, which are documented in these two reports and which ultimately culminated in the new wasted food scale, which is the graphic that replaces the hierarchy. And there's a couple terms here I've thrown out that it might just be worth pausing and defining because we've gotten questions about these in the last month or so since these reports came out. So just to head off any confusion there, upcycling in our analysis refers to using food scraps and parts of food ingredients to make new products, such as using spent grains from the brewing process to make flour and snack bars. Land application refers to spreading, spraying, or injecting raw wasted food on or below the surface of the soil, which is a practice that can be used by food manufacturers and processors. I just want to make the distinction that land application does not refer to applying compost or digestate to the soil, for example. And then the sewer wastewater treatment pathway refers to sending food down the drain through the sewer system to a water resource recovery facility or a wastewater treatment plant, where it may or may not end up being anaerobically digested. If food waste is being trucked to a water resource recovery facility to be anaerobically digested, that would be considered the anaerobic digestion pathway, since that food did not go through the sewer system and wastewater treatment plant to arrive there. So while we chose 11 pathways for analysis, we did not include every possible food waste management method, and there's several emerging pathways that are not common or at a commercial scale, or for which there was enough data to do the analysis. I'm going to turn it to you, Shannon, for the next slide.
So in order to evaluate the pathways, we did two complementary analyses and then together merged the results of these together into the wasted food scale, which we'll talk about in a second. So the first was a more traditional analysis using LCA or life cycle assessment. We picked 11 environmental indicators that we thought were relevant to food waste management, and we searched for data on those in LCAs about the food waste pathways. We ended up with about 250 studies that we reviewed in depth and compared the results of in order to come up with the conclusions of that section. The second analysis was more novel. It was a circularity assessment. So given the increasing importance to EPA of a circular economy, we looked at 4 particular criteria that we set based on the definition of circularity in both the Save Our Seas Act 2.0, which guides some of EPA's work, as well as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's work, which is pretty widely accepted. Our 4 criteria were: does it help prevent waste? Does it maintain the output's highest potential value? For example, like, is it feeding people or is it creating energy? You want to stay free of contaminants so that you can reuse materials and keep them in the circular economy. And then the highest bar would be, can it help to regenerate ecosystems through improved soil health and through climate resilience? And in this case, climate resilience is typically about managing for drought and things like that. So the benefit of combining these two approaches was the ability to see the trade-offs between the environmental impacts, which LCA helps you to do, but also between the environmental impacts and the circularity factors. LCA cannot capture resource conservation, for instance. If you have something valuable like wasted food that's full of nutrients, LCA looks at what you did with it. Circularity can say, what could you have done with it, and compare those outcomes. So for example, creating energy can reduce a lot of your environmental impacts, but if that food has also been used to make new food for humans or make valuable materials or improve soil health, it may not have factored those things in. So one note before we look at the findings is that we did focus strictly on environmental performance in both these analyses and didn't consider social and economic factors. Next slide. So here are the findings in their sort of simplified form from our analysis. This is our new wasted food scale, which replaces the food recovery hierarchy. It ranks wasted food pathways from most to least environmentally preferable based on both our life cycle analysis and our circularity assessment. The pathways are grouped into tiers where EPA determined them to have equivalent performance. And again, it looks specifically at the environmental performance, not the social and economic performance, and it focuses specifically on food. So you couldn't apply this wasted food scale to plastics, for example. We looked particularly at food in all of its sort of wetness and value, and looked at specifically putting food through all of these pathways, and then how would you rank them? So before we dig into details, I'd like to just talk about sort of some broad findings that we found. I mean, one is that source reduction, donation, and upcycling are always going to be the most environmentally preferable pathways because of the magnitude of the impacts associated with producing food. If there's any way to help us get supply and demand closer together, that's going to be the winning strategy. And that's why you'll see these at the top of our hierarchy. And then I think married with that is that the benefits of these other green pathways are small relative to the environmental impacts of producing food in the first place. So when you hear about the latest, greatest, newfangled way to recycle food, you always have to remind yourself of what it took to make that food. And so, for example, anaerobic digestion is the most efficient way to make energy out of food. You still only recover about 20% of the energy that it took to make that food item. So these are good things to do, but in the big picture, prevention is always going to be way better. Third big broad finding I wanted to point out is just the sizable methane emissions we saw from landfill and from down the drain. Wasted food decays really rapidly in anaerobic conditions. And in the case of sewer transport, it may not be there for long, but it's uncontrolled methane emissions. And in the landfill, it's there for a long time. So even if you're capturing some of it, you're still losing a lot of it. And these emissions far outweigh our ability to counteract them. So for example, we might have anaerobic digestion at the wastewater treatment plant, but we're going to have lost more methane on the way there than we can recover from the wastewater treatment plant with anaerobic digestion. Same thing with landfills. We're going to have lost more methane than the amount of carbon we can sequester in the landfill. And so these two just really stand out for their significant climate impacts. I think the other thing to point out is just while this horseshoe really pushes, it tries to explain to you that what we really want you to do and what we really want you to avoid doing. The other pathways are all marked green because at least from a climate standpoint, they're all near neutral. They might be beneficial, they might be neutral, but none of these ones in green are harming. They're not adding additional problems to our climate issue. They're not adding additional net greenhouse gas emissions from what you already had from producing the food. Also, some of these green pathways are really make valuable soil amendments. And that's something that circularity could highlight that we'd had trouble really quantifying using LCA. So whether you're making compost or digestate from anaerobic digestion or biosolids from anaerobic digestion or other processes at a wastewater treatment plant, these things are an opportunity to bring nutrients back to the soil. They can help us manage, all kinds of issues. And compared to synthetic fertilizers, if they're used on agricultural land where you would have instead used synthetic fertilizers, they require less energy to produce, they provide more organic matter, and once they're applied, they lose less of their nitrogen to the air and to the water, which is when you think of eutrophication and all these other kind of problems that come from use of synthetic fertilizers. So there's some real value being created in some of these green pathways. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out that this analysis is not should not be forever, right? As we change our energy mix in the United States, it may change the emphasis of some of these pathways. Right now, the life cycle analysis results in particular are really driven by how much energy did you use and how much energy did you create? Because that not only affects greenhouse gas emissions, that also affects energy demand, and it also affects, if it was fossil fuel energy used, acidification, eutrophication, toxicity, particulate matter. About half of the factors we looked at are affected by either using energy or displacing the use of energy. And so as that energy mix gets cleaner in the United States, which I hope it will, you'll see less of a penalty for using energy at somewhere like a composting facility, but also less of a benefit to creating energy somewhere like an anaerobic digestion or incinerator. So just something to think about as we move forward in time, that we may want to revisit this as conditions of the U.S. change. Claudia, you.
Oh, Claudia, now we can't hear you. So why don't we, Shannon, do you have a few more things that you wanted to say on this slide while Claudia gets her?
Oh, she's okay. I didn't realize she was broken. No, I think that she was I'm in the research office and Claudia's in the program office. And so often we sort of tag team, and I talk about the science and she talks about sort of what does it mean. And I think what this means is we really need to focus on prevention, and we really need to focus on not wasting food as a resource, doing something useful with that food rather than letting it decay into methane.
You're here. All right. Well, I love that. With that, why don't we move to questions? And while, Claudia, you can catch us up. I know she's dialing in right now. So we'll get there. Never a dull moment. But at first, I just want to say that these reports are a big deal. And I have to thank both of you, because I know that you were these reports would not have happened without you. It wasn't like somebody else said, oh, go do these reports, and then you just did them. It was like you really saw the need and went through all the things you have to go through to make these come to fruition. And so I just want to start by just thanking you for that, because I think they're such an incredible addition to the whole way we will go about this work. So thank you. And for all the hurdles you had to jump to get to this moment, we appreciate it. I also want to thank you, because I'm going to say faking it till I make it for a long time on this whole landfill food waste methane thing. I have for a long time saying food decays really fast, it can't be captured by the time these things are capped. And it's one of the top contributors, and kind of doing some hand waving. So I know that I am very thankful to have actual numbers and actual research to finally back up the claims that I've been hand waving for so long. So thank you for that as well. So Shannon, 58% is a big number, and we can finally say that food waste is the top contributor to landfill methane with definitive information. But I think this whole thing about how quickly food waste decays and the rate, it seems in my mind to have several implications to it. And I was wondering if you could just sort of talk about what are the implications to finding how quickly to your findings about the rate of decay for food waste in landfills.
Sure. So like you, I when I started in this job, which is obviously long after you started working on food waste, I couldn't believe we didn't have a number, and I called sort of every EPA scientist I could, every outside scientist I could. I thought, why isn't this number out there? Because the landfill scientists actually knew food decayed quicker. That isn't a controversial point. It's just that nobody had run the numbers. And so we did put it through multiple layers of peer review, just in case there was something we hadn't thought of. But yeah, this is really exciting, because it's really all about food waste, leaves, and grass. These are the things that decay way more quickly than everything else. So just to put it sort of in perspective, if you think about how a landfill operates, people often they have to put by law, many of the landfills who are subject to the new source performance standard of EPA have to put in their gas collection system within 4 years of the waste going in. Well, after 3.5 years, half the carbon in food waste has already turned to methane, right? But for cardboard, that takes 23 years. So those landfill gas capture systems are doing a great job on cardboard, on paper, on wood. It's these quick decaying materials that we really need to get a handle on. And whether we can do more in a rulemaking setting with landfill control technologies is to be debated. But we know that diversion is the best answer. We know that you can't put a landfill gas collection system on every day. And we know that in that first 3.5 years, we're losing most of the methane. So we put a table of these rates. So widely accepted science behind these rates. They're in a number of EPA's models. We hope people really stop and take a minute to think about what this means for how cities and states want to tackle methane emissions. Because diversion, either through prevention or through composting, anaerobic digestion, many of these other options that are either beneficial or neutral from a climate standpoint, is going to be the best answer. And we've done such a good job as a country of getting the leaves and grass out of landfills. We just need to do a similarly good job getting the food waste out.
Yeah, here. But just to like follow up on that, is there a certain amount, like you could imagine rules that like have landfills capped earlier or something like that, but is the rate of decay so fast that there's a certain amount of the methane that like we're just never gonna capture, no matter how good we get?
For sure there is some we can never capture. Could we do a better job? Probably. I have not modeled the different scenarios that people have proposed, but we're not going to get at the heart of the problem, right? I mean, the root of the problem is that it decays immediately, and that half of it's going to be gone in 3.5 years. So right now we're only getting 61% of it's not being captured. You could probably take that down a little, but you can't ever make it 0.
3.5 years, and then it's acting for 10 to 20 years at 80 times the potency of CO2. So yeah, it really feels like an opportunity to get into that. So Shannon, just quick kind of clarifying question. Will this research change the EPA's estimates for overall methane emissions from landfills?
No, we actually are consistent with the overall estimate. And so it's 58% of what EPA already estimated to be landfill emissions.
Okay.
And there is plenty of research happening at EPA and elsewhere about total landfill methane emissions. There's been some remote sensing work that caught a lot of our attention, showing some of these super landfills and things that maybe we hadn't accounted for. We're going to learn more, but right now we stuck within the traditional EPA estimate of landfill methane emissions and just tried to figure out how much of it was due to food waste.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that, Shannon. And just to catch everyone up here, it's never a dull moment on a webinar if you can't have a few technical difficulties. So I think Claudia has joined us by phone, at least for now. Are you there, Claudia?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. My computer has really been having a rough day. So apologies that I missed a couple minutes. Zoom is completely not working anymore, but I am here. So thank you.
All right, good. We'll work with it. Great. Well, Claudia, first things first to you, like, why the horseshoe? I've been dying to ask you this.
Yeah. So I have to say that working on developing this new graphic was actually really a highlight of the last few years. It was really fun, and I think it's important work to create a graphic that makes sense and balances a lot of different things. So it's not, for anyone who's done that kind of work, it's not an easy task. And I will say we went through a lot of different iterations. I think what we liked about this shape is it sort of conjures up the circularity aspect of all of this. We wanted to also make really clear that, the prevention is like absolutely the highest priority. And then there are some things that you should try to avoid, if at all possible, landfilling, incineration, and sending food waste down the drain. So we kind of wanted to make sure those were separate. We also really wanted to make sure that this looked quite different from the previous one, so that it was really obvious that they were two different things. So we steered away from doing, a triangle shape and anything that sort of looked a little bit too much like a hierarchy. And I think we also wanted to, we have this challenge, I think, of communicating that there's several of these pathways that are ranked equally. And so coming up with a shape where you can have two, different pathways in the same section or tier was also a bit of a challenge. And I think communicating that can be challenging still, even with this shape. But hopefully we're getting there. So I think those are a few of the things we liked about this particular shape. Also, to be honest, you have to have a shape that just works in on a web page and on a PowerPoint slide and isn't too, too horizontal or too vertical either. So those were some of the reasons. And I don't know if I missed any discussion while I was offline for a few minutes about sort of some of the differences between the old and the new hierarchy. I'm happy to talk about those unless Shannon touched on them as well.
No, I mean, that's kind of where you're going. I mean, I think, what do you think are the most important, like, new messages that the wasted food scale communicates that are different from the old one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously we still have prevention and donation at the top, and those aren't new, but I think they're still really important to communicate. I think the most important new messages are that composting is ranked equally with anaerobic digestion, where there's beneficial use of digestate or biosolids, and that sending food down the drain is ranked at the bottom with landfilling and incineration. I think, honestly, those are two of the findings that answer probably the questions we've gotten the most over the years. And I also think that the splitting of anaerobic digestion based on whether the nutrient-rich byproducts are being used in a beneficial way is important. And it highlights the perhaps sometimes surprising fact that those nutrients are often being disposed. That's something that we knew, but I think sometimes people are like, wait, what do you mean those are just being disposed? I mean, I've definitely gotten that question. Because when those biosolids or digestate is used, for example, as anaerobic or as alternative daily cover in landfills, those nutrients just end up in the landfill, and we're missing the opportunity to, keep those nutrients in the system and repair depleted soils and stuff. So I think those are probably the three things I would say are kind of the most notable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciated that sort of split for the anaerobic digestion, because I think I know I've been pushed a lot of times, like, how do you feel about this? And you feel differently depending on what happens with the digestate. So, yeah, great. Thank you, Claudia. All right, Shannon, back to you. So one thing that struck me in the report, that was that on one hand, it stated the conclusion, like one of the key conclusions is that the benefits of pathways beyond source reduction, donation, and upcycling are small relative to the environmental impacts of food production. So they can do little to offset the environmental impacts of food production is one thing the report says. But then it also says that all wasted food pathways other than landfill and sewer wastewater treatment demonstrate beneficial or near neutral global warming potential. So to me, those are a little bit at odds, those two statements. And I'm just wondering if you could kind of explain and reconcile how on one hand, the benefits are small, but on the other hand, the benefits are there.
Sure, and I apologize if there was any confusion. Those two statements are sort of about two different time frames. So the first statement is talking about cradle to grave, right? It's looking at like from the production of food all the way to the point of when it's wasted. And then managing that waste. Whereas the second one is looking just at the waste management process. And so the first one is saying, like, you've produced this food, you've used all these resources, you've created all these emissions. You're never going to get that back. You can never erase that, right? Whereas the second statement is saying, okay, you've already wasted the food. Let's put that aside for a second and let's think about what to do with it. For cases where you can't prevent it, like let's say chicken bones, like let's say you've even made stock out of them. You're done, right? There's nothing left you can do with them. What should you do with it? And that's saying you're not going to add to the environmental problem by doing any of these green pathways, right? They're pretty neutral from a climate standpoint. They might have a small benefit. They might, in some cases, have a small cost, but we're talking about a near neutral performance. So does that help? And I apologize, those sentences should probably never be used back to back.
Had that burning question as I was reading through, but that makes a lot of sense. Super, well, let's dive into a few of the specific pathways here. And I think, as Claudia mentioned, one pathway that's pretty new and pretty significant in these new set of analyses is sewer and sending food down the drain. I knew that when we at ReFed did our first greenhouse gas emission factor research, I was very surprised to see sewer come out worse than landfills, because I think there's something that feels kind of natural about putting food into the garbage disposal, and it seems like it's not that bad. It very clean, So can you tell us a little bit more about like why this is ranked so low? And I saw a couple questions in the chat as well. Like, so should we, close all our garbage disposers so we get them out of sinks at this point? If landfill's really better, like what are the implications of it as well?
So for the scale, we put it as equal to landfills, equitable to landfills. I wouldn't say it's worse than landfills. And I didn't see any, there's a range of data for landfills and there's a range of data available for sewer. I wouldn't say it's worse. But I also wouldn't see it as the solution, right? And I think what makes me nervous is that we're seeing a lot of technologies being sold as solutions to food waste that ultimately put the food waste down the drain. And so this is something new we now need to wrestle with, is that if we're getting methane from the sewer in a similar way that we get it from the landfill, because both have anaerobic conditions, that's probably not the best alternative, right? We may want to be diverting that food waste from landfill to somewhere besides down the drain. There's a lot of new work on sewer methane, not on food waste in particular, but on methane from sewer. And like the work you see with remote sensing on landfills, they're saying, wow, we think we underestimated the amount of methane coming from sewers. And so this is going to become of increasing importance, right? And we need to do more research in this space. What we know is that there are methane emissions, and they're dependent on a whole bunch of factors. We know that food isn't in the sewer for as long as it's in a landfill, but we also know it's uncontrolled methane releases during that time. There's no sewer gas capture system in place like there is in a landfill. So more research to be done, but for sure there's methane associated with it. It also can cause a lot of problems. It's really an interesting policy question of where some places have mandated disposers and some places have prohibited them. It's still a question that I'm wrestling with and we're learning a lot about. We did a report a couple of years ago looking into this as one of the research questions, and found, it can cause a lot of extra energy use at the wastewater treatment plant to put this many nutrients down the drain. In low water areas, it can cause clogs and things like that. If there's a lot of fat, oil, and grease in it, it can cause clogs. Now, those things don't happen in every situation, right? But we know there's enough red flags here that we don't think it's the answer. And so for now, it's in the bottom tier with a lot of work needing to be done on both quantifying how much methane is coming from food waste in particular, and also what can we do about it? Is there an end of pipe technology that can help with this?
Yeah, I have to say, before reading this report, I never thought about emissions that were happening kind of like while it was getting to the wastewater treatment plant. It never occurred to me like that was a component in all of this. And I think, and when I first looked at it, I thought, oh gosh, I know in California, they're really leaning in on co-digestion, right? And in putting anaerobic digestion capture systems on wastewater treatment plants, trucking food there. And I thought, oh no, is this gonna cause problems to that? But you clarified for me that trucking it there is actually considered anaerobic digestion. And then depending on the end use, right, is sort of where it falls in the hierarchy. And maybe that's a good segue, Claudia, to you on the anaerobic digestion conclusions and that distinction that you're now drawing between beneficial use and not less than beneficial use is probably not how you phrase it, but can you kind of spell out for people, and then also the use of wastewater treatment plants, can you kind of walk us through a little bit more of the reasoning and like what does it look like to do beneficial use versus some of the other options here?
Sure, yeah. So I think you already touched on really the differences and made those clear between sort of sending food down the drain and the AD pathway. But in terms of some of the differences, so we have compost, ranked at the same as AD with beneficial use of digestate and biosolids, and they both offer benefits. They're ranked equally because, while composting offers long-term contributions to soil health and ecosystem resilience, AD recovers energy, and digestate offers soil benefits as well, although they're not as well studied and seem to be perhaps shorter lived than the benefits of applying compost. The benefits of adding biosolids to soils are much better understood, but biosolids can contain more contaminants, and their application is highly regulated, which restricts their use and potential for circularity. Just that was part of the analysis as well. I think that some of the natural questions coming out of this are, okay, well, what should I invest in? Should I do AD? Should I do composting? And there's really a lot of considerations that need to be, considered there in terms of comparing those two pathways. There's the volume of materials to be managed. So with current technologies available, AD usually requires a minimum volume of feedstock to operate, and composting can more easily be scaled to the volume of materials available. There's also the issue of what kind of quality and what kind of types of materials are available. Are they source separated? Are they homogeneous? What other materials are available for co-processing, like yard trimmings and wood waste and manure? AD can better handle feedstocks that have higher moisture content and are more homogeneous, such as food processing waste streams. And the optimal AD feedstock mixture is likely to be determined by biogas production. But composting is better for non-homogeneous feedstocks like post-consumer food waste, and then materials like wood chips and sticks and yard waste. But it also requires, and of course it requires those carbon-rich materials to process the wasted food. So there's a lot of different factors. I mean, budget is a factor. AD can be more expensive to set up depending on the volume. Available land is an issue for large volumes of materials. AD can process more with less space. There's the issue of, end use. What are you going to do ultimately with the output? Stable and mature compost is safe and easy to use anywhere and doesn't contain pathogens. But digestate can be quite liquid and may contain some pathogens and might benefit from further treatment, such as composting. So there's really a lot of factors, and of course, not to dismiss the energy production. And AD produces biogas, which can be used to generate renewable energy, and that's an added benefit, but also requires the necessary infrastructure so that you don't just end up flaring the biogas. There's really a lot of considerations. There's no one size fits all, but yeah, they're both good options just depending on what your context is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that point of scaling is an interesting one, right? I remember long ago I went to the UK to visit some stuff, and they told me stories about digesters that had been built, and then like the source feedstock had run out and they were growing crops to put in the digesters, which obviously was not the point. So I think getting them sized right, you're kind of locked into that. So making sure that locking in is the right answer seems important as well. What about industrial uses, Claudia? That was an always slightly ambiguous term that I'm glad to see go, but at the same time, I know anaerobic digestion was a big part of that, but I always thought about it as bioplastics that were made from like kind of food waste, or my favorite is those t-shirts that were made from milk waste, supposedly, that came out at some point. So some of these things have kind of dropped off, I think, at least per my interpretation of the original industrial use category. So what are we supposed to think about those?
Yeah, and I think that even now, compared to when the hierarchy came out in the 90s, there's an even greater variety of methods that can be considered industrial uses. It's really an area that seems to be growing exponentially, and the environmental performance of all those different types of pathways can really vary from one to another pretty tremendously. So we really didn't, another issue, frankly, is just lack of data, because a lot of those pathways that you mentioned are not really at commercial scale. So when we chose which pathways, which we ended up choosing 11, when we set out on doing this analysis 2 years ago, we prioritized those pathways that were at commercial scale. So there's all these like really cool things going on, but they're just not really at a commercial scale at this point, so they weren't included. I think as others emerge and as there's more data and more studies and they're being scaled up, we would really like to examine those as well. But as for right now, there's just so many types of potential industrial uses that we could not look at them all.
That makes sense. All right, let's move to the upcycling animal feed, leaving food unharvested sort of set of categories here. Anything people should know in particular about those? I know one thing I've been curious about is why upcycling isn't considered source reduction, because I think we've always considered it a prevention strategy. And I see one question that is leaving food unharvested only after as much food recovery as possible is done via gleaning, and kind of how should people interpret that food leaving food unharvested as well?
Yeah, and that's a one that's definitely caused, I think, a lot of questions, and so I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk about that one a little bit. So I'll start with the unharvested one. I mean, as far as that ranking, let's be clear about what that is. So it's not intended to imply that edible food should be left on the field. I mean, of course, food should be used to feed people, and you see unharvested is ranked below donation, which includes gleaning, of course, and also below upcycling. So what really went behind this, I mean, so after harvesting food, right, obviously energy and resources are needed to store and process and transport and serve that food. And environmental impacts obviously accumulate as food moves through this supply chain. So if the food would not end up being eaten and would be wasted, then it would have been better to avoid the emissions and resource consumption of all of those things and leaving them unharvested. That's just one way to have avoided all of those downstream resources and GHG emissions that would have gone into that. So when crops are left on the field, they can be grazed by animals or plowed into the soil, which can increase, soil organic matter and provide plant nutrients. But I just want to be really clear that, this one's a little bit confusing, right? Because it's really, it's kind of a backward looking thing, right? Like if the food was going to be wasted anyway, it would have been better to just leave it on the field than to harvest it and have it go through all of this only to end up being wasted. But crops can remain unharvested for so many reasons, often due to various forces beyond the farmer's control, right? Like market standards and demand and commodity prices, weather events, pests, diseases, labor shortages. There's so many different things that go into that. And so obviously, but when possible, efforts should be made to develop alternative markets for food that is edible and safe to eat, such as donation. We're seeing secondary sales channels and upcycling. All of those things will be better, right? But because they all result in food going to its intended purpose, which is to feed people. And those are obviously considered better options than leaving crops unharvested. But we included it in the analysis because it does happen. And the analysis shows that if the food would not have been eaten, then leaving it unharvested avoids wasting all the resources that would have been used as the food moves through that supply chain. So again, I think in reality, this only really helps after the fact, and its ranking does not necessarily help any producers make a decision with the information they have in front of them and the conditions that they're subject to at the time. So I think the bottom line here really is that the ranking of unharvested doesn't imply that food crops should be left on the fields if they could have otherwise been used to nourish humans. Obviously, we want to emphasize that food should go to feed people.
Yeah.
On your, sorry, do you have a follow-up, or
no? Go
I can
ahead.
also
Go ahead.
address your other question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to address your other question quickly about upcycling. I'm sorry, I can't see your face. But as far as you asked about upcycling and why isn't it considered prevention or source reduction, I think that, those definitions can sort of vary from context to context. In terms of prevention, I mean, we defined in the report source reduction as decreasing the generation of wasted food by preventing food from becoming waste at any point in the food supply chain. So there we're talking about, basically making the most of what you have and preventing it from having to be managed in any other, being managed as, in any other way. For purpose, I just want to note though, because this can be kind of confusing, for purposes of the circularity assessment, source reduction, donation, and upcycling were all considered together as prevention because they all keep food in, to keep humans in the human food supply chain. So it's a little bit confusing, but I think that those things can be defined in various ways, and that's how we did it for these purposes.
Okay, that makes sense. Shannon, so much is focused on climate these days, but this report is incredible in that it summarizes results from pretty much every study out there and on so many environmental factors and impact categories, not just climate. So were there any notable conclusions that you had on some of the other environmental impacts that are, because they're not climate related?
So, I mean, we wanted to leave we wanted to turn over every stone, right? We wanted to look and see if that was true. It turned out actually things are fairly correlated. And that's largely because in this life cycle assessment piece, it's so much is dependent on whether you use energy or whether you displace the use of energy. Because the biggest driver of, say, acidification in these pathways is fossil fuel energy use, right? The biggest driver of eutrophication is fossil fuel energy use for most of the pathways. So it was a phenomenon I wasn't expecting to see things so tightly correlated with energy use. And it's why that finding about that we put in the conclusions of the report about, like, if the U.S. energy mix changes, we do need to relook at this, because so much of this data is based on the fact that you're displacing fossil fuel use. If you're displacing solar, suddenly making energy probably doesn't make a lot of sense. You should do something else with that food, you know? So no, we didn't see, and I will say that the best data, the most prolific data and the most accurate data we had, I think, was around greenhouse gas and energy. The data got a little shakier when we got to things like water consumption. Some of it didn't really make sense, and we may use some professional judgment to say, I'm not sure about that. Because there were
maybe some of that circularity assessment as well, right? Which is the
well,
other.
in the circularity assessment, we were able to be more qualitative and go based on the literature that wasn't specific circularity literature, but literature about the pathways. We were go to direct literature sources about, like, what's happening in these pathways. And so I think we could be a little more accurate because we didn't have to be quantitative.
Got it. Okay. All right, Claudia, last to you, and then we'll turn to a few more of these audience questions here. How do you see these reports impacting EPA's programs or, like, state policies or other initiatives out there? Like, how would you like to see them used?
Sure. I mean, I think internally we're seeing more attention to the issue. I mean, having the science and the stats laid out clearly for decision makers within EPA at all levels is extremely helpful. We laid out what we suspected about landfill methane, but we didn't previously have the compelling stat. And that's really been motivating and eye-opening, I think, both internally and externally. So we're having discussions on next steps and how to move the program forward, taking all of this into account. I do want to mention, we've already seen an increase in EPA funding. It's obviously not enough to meet demand, but to support, recycling, which includes organics recycling infrastructure. And so I'll just mention that a couple months ago, we awarded $105 million to our solid waste infrastructure for recycling program to states and territories and political subdivisions. And over 40 million of that 105 went to support 33 projects that include organics recycling activities. So that's, obviously not enough to meet the demand, but it's a really good start. And there's more money left in that program, as well as our recycling education and outreach program. We're making more funding announcements actually tomorrow on both of those programs, so stay tuned for that. We've also been doing more work to promote community composting and understand the value of compost beyond agricultural use. So we're excited to share some of that research and products soon. And we've seen more of a shift towards supporting prevention work, specifically with consumers, by doing some foundational work to lay out what a national consumer-facing campaign would look like, building on, the great work that communities are already doing in their areas. So I think there's more to come. Stay tuned. As far as, state and local government policy, I mean, I think many folks on this webinar who have been steeped in these issues for a long time, many wanted to develop their own more nuanced hierarchies to help sort of answer some of the questions they were getting within their areas. And they're probably happy to see that EPA laid out the science and did that detailed analysis. One thing I hope that this can help with is really helping policymakers avoid unintended consequences. And Shannon mentioned this before, but of shifting from one waste management approach to another that doesn't have any greater benefit. I think you probably touched on this, Shannon, but if we see states and cities with organic landfill bans and they're just shifting from landfills to sending the food waste down the drain, that's an unintended consequences. And so hopefully, these reports can kind of help shed some light on that. And I think they also shed light on some lesser known options. I mean, I've been asked what upcycling is many times since these reports came out, which was kind of surprising to me because, I think about this stuff a lot and I don't always realized that updating kind of a seemingly simple graphic can just start a lot of conversations and open up, you know, just new opportunities that people hadn't thought of. So I think, I mean, you know, I'll never shut up about prevention. And so I have to, of course, say something about that. And it's not new, and it's, you know, it's the most beneficial approach, and that it always was. But I think these reports, again, underscore the need to focus on that as well, and to really attack this issue from multiple angles, and not to overlook the benefits of generating less wasted food in the first place, while you're also building infrastructure to deal with the wasted food you can't avoid. So those are some of my thoughts and takeaways.
All right, well, rapid fire. We have 2 more minutes for questions from the audience here. So there's several about waste to energy. Kind of, you know, is all incineration to be avoided? Why not, you know, why is the energy not counted? That sort of stuff. So can you talk about the impact of food discarded as waste to energy? And is it as bad as landfills in terms of methane?
Sure. So lots of ways to make energy from waste, lots of new ways to make energy from waste that are being discovered. Incineration in particular is less efficient than anaerobic digestion. So what we're trying to show here is that you can get more energy per unit of food by putting it in a digester than you can by putting it in an incinerator. And the reason for that is that food is so wet, right? And so in some cases, you even have to dry the food before you can then burn it in the incinerator. So you have to use energy to make energy. And so it's just not a very efficient way to make energy from food. Different story for other municipal solid waste, but for food in particular, food does result in some dioxins coming out of an incinerator, and food is wet, which causes a lot of problems for incinerators. So it's just not an efficient way to go about it. Plus, you're creating, from a circularity standpoint, you're creating hazardous waste instead of value.
Right, right. Okay, great. Another question, quick one, in our last minute. Does EPA have the ability to enforce actions according to the new framework, or is it only guidance?
Claudia. It was only yeah. No, I mean, this is, you know, our program on food waste reduction is non-regulatory. So in terms of enforcement, that's really left to, or not enforcement, but in terms of setting regulations and priority, and, you know, setting policies and regulations to prioritize one pathway over another, that's really left to the states and the cities.
Got it. All right, and I see a few questions about kind of the 3.5 years and fugitive emissions and how the methane that was kept, you know, how it was modeled and measured. I'm going to refer you to the report, and I think there's some contact information there. You can maybe bother Shannon with those more detailed science, landfill science questions separately. Because for now, that's all we have time for on questions. And I just want to, again, thank Shannon and Claudia for just all of the work that has led up to this. In all the different ways there was work required. It's such an addition to the whole body of work on this, and appreciate you coming today, but also just all the work, and Claudia for working through your technical challenges, and everyone for working through those with us. And with that, it was great to speak with you guys. Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks.
All right. Be well, everyone.